All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar about Iran and its nuclear program. I'm Blaise Mishtal, the Vice President of Policy here at JINSA. I think we've all heard and discussed Iran's interest or involvement in Hamas's horrific October 7th attack on Israel and what Iran might have wanted or stood to gain from the attack, and most often what's described is Iran's interest in throwing a wrench in the regional normalization, and particularly Israeli-Saudi normalization work that was underway. In fact, I think Supreme Leader Khamenei just said as much recently that the conflict was necessary in order to bring an end to the possibility of Israel and Saudi Arabia normalizing ties and building a relationship that would potentially help contain and push back on Iran's regional aggression. But there's been one other effect of the attack and the subsequent war, whether intentionally or not, on Iran and Hamas's part. What has happened over the last 8 months is that attention, both here in Washington and in Israel, has been diverted away from Iran's nuclear program, while the program has continued advancing in significant and worrying ways. And we at JINSA believe it's really important to continue paying attention to what's happening underground in Iran's nuclear facilities as it grows closer and closer, and as we'll discuss today, perhaps even crosses the threshold of a nuclear weapons capability. To have that discussion, I'm really pleased to be joined by two of my colleagues, Jonathan Rui, the Director of Foreign Policy here at JINSA, who I've been working the Iran nuclear file with for longer than I care to remember, and Gabriel Noronha, a fellow at JINSA, and a former State Department official working the Iran file there. So, Jonathan, maybe I could turn to you to start with giving us some information about where Iran's enrichment program stands right now. I guess as a brief reminder, there's 3 parts to a functional nuclear bomb. There's the fissile material, either enriched uranium or plutonium, that makes it nuclear. There's what's called the weapon, which makes the fissile material actually achieve critical mass and creates the nuclear self-sustaining chain reaction and the mushroom cloud. And then there's the delivery vehicle, whether that's a ballistic missile or something else. And obviously, most of the attention has been focused on Iran's enrichment program, trying to create fissile material, highly enriched uranium. So, Jonathan, can you tell us where they are in that process?
Yeah, happy to. Thank you, Blaise, and thank you all for joining today. I've got some quick little slides to put up. We're not going to do death by PowerPoint here, but just a few pictorial representations, I think, to help make some of the more important points about the enrichment progress. So if we could put those up now, please. So just very quickly, this one shows Iran's expanding enrichment capacity. I really want to show one thing here, which is look at since November 2020, when President Biden was elected and announced his intention to rejoin the JCPOA, Iran quickly started amassing some negotiating leverage, at the very least, by installing over time ever more and more advanced centrifuges. And you see the higher up you go in this chart, the more you go from blue to green, the more advanced those centrifuges are. And this enrichment capacity basically means, in layman's terms, how much uranium Iran can put through and enrich to higher capacity or higher enrichment level at any given time. And just as quick backdrop, this slide shows on the far upper right, you see that abrupt uptick in the lightest green shade. That's Iran's projected growth in the enrichment capacity. Over the weekend, they announced they're going to put a few more centrifuge cascades or clusters of centrifuges into their deeply buried Fordo facility. And so while this is a problem, I want to use this chart to show the larger context in which it's really symptomatic of a larger problem, which is that Iran has been greatly expanding this capacity for years and years now. If we go to the next slide, please. And so we've heard a lot about, over the years, the various stockpile sizes and their quality. So the two to really focus on are Iran's 60% uranium and 20% uranium. 90%, we've all heard, is the threshold for being able to put it inside a missile warhead. But I would say that even this stockpile and the 20% stockpile that I'll just show in a second are both technically weapons grade. Iran has gotten a lot of experience enriching borderline 90% uranium over the years. I would draw everyone's attention back to, if you all saw the Oppenheimer film last summer, they kept returning to the fishbowl and the wine glass, filling them up with marbles to show their progress in producing fissile material. In that movie, it was a race to fill the fishbowl and wine glass up as fast as possible. Whereas in Iran's case, it's using uranium, so it's just the fishbowl that's applicable. But really what they've done is they're not racing to fill the fishbowl all the way up to the top of the marbles. Instead, they have, I mean, give or take about 10 different fishbowls that are all 95 or 90% full at the moment, because of their ability to produce this 60% and 20% uranium, which represents 95 and 90% respectively of all the work and time required to actually get to weapons grade. We go to the next slide, please. Again, similar thing here with a 20% stockpile going back to November 2020. We see the assiduous growth in this as well. That's related to the first slide with their enrichment capacity that's grown in tandem. And you see at the bottom these little sort of increasingly dark dotted lines horizontally, SQ1, 2, 3, and so forth. That's a significant quantity or bombs worth of uranium at this level. And you can see, we're all focused on how quickly they can break out. We hear a lot, even from leading Pentagon officials, their breakout time it was months. Now it's weeks. And we all remember in the JCPOA, they talked about a 12-month breakout time. But we'll go to the last slide and I'll make a little bit, a slightly different point here, which is I don't want people to focus just on that breakout time, which now is probably 1 to 2 weeks to enrich their first bombs worth, their first significant quantity. But I want to show this slide here, which is it matters how quickly they can produce that first bombs worth. But what matters even more is look what they can do sustained over time. So in 1 month today, they could produce 8 bombs worth, which is a categorically different proposition than trying to just deal with one. And then over time, they've got a small fieldable arsenals worth over the course of about 3 months, which is the cycle of an IAEA reporting time period. And the red line is what we're focused on now. The green line shows how much more it's grown, because in November 2022, that's when President Biden and Secretary Blinken privately admitted that the JCPOA was dead. And we've seen the cost of the inertia of the Biden administration's policy since. It's not a status quo. This gets worse and worse, as we can see in the growth of the red line compared to the green. And I'll just add one final comment here. All of this adds up to Iran's ability, obviously, to produce an arsenal's worth, and by skirting just up to what they've been told are red lines by the United States and Israel. But as they install more and more better centrifuges, as their stockpiles grow, and as they enrich higher quality uranium, it gets easier and easier to move the infrastructure to enrich a bomb underground into small facilities and to disperse them more widely. So I'll just stop there. Thank you, Blake.
So I guess to follow up on that quickly, Jonathan, you mentioned with the first slide that big uptick in planned centrifuges that Iran announced over this weekend. What would the effect of those additional centrifuges be on the last slide that you showed, which is how much time would take Iran to produce multiple bombs worth of enriched uranium? Because on the one hand, you said breakout time is now measured in days. So does it affect how quickly they can get one bomb, or does it affect how quickly they can get multiple bombs? What is the impact of that announcement over the weekend?
So I think it's certainly more the latter. It's kind of diminishing returns at this point from Iran's perspective, and how much more they can cut that breakout time. For the first bomb, a matter of a week or so. It's a rough approximation, estimating this as much art as science, and really 1 week versus 2 weeks may not make a world of difference. So even if on the margins it reduces the breakout time for the first bomb, it is marginal. I think the bigger concern is what it means for their larger ability to keep building out this arsenal, as we say, escalate horizontally by increasing its capacity to produce an arsenal over time and sustain one breakout after another after another.
So, Gabe, let me turn to you now and sort of pose the question. Iran might have this potential ability to create multiple bombs worth of enriched uranium, but they haven't done so yet. And perhaps more importantly, we've heard repeatedly over the last several years from both American and Israeli officials, even if they do produce weapons grade uranium, they haven't weaponized yet. They haven't figured out how to take that uranium and put it in a device that goes boom. And that's 2 years away. And as it's been 2 years away for multiple years now, because I guess the assessment is that Iran hasn't made the decision or hasn't started sort of work towards weaponization. But there's been rumors recently that that might no longer be true. So what do we know about their weaponization program, and how confident can we be that they're indefinitely 2 years away from weaponizing?
So that's a great question. So I think it's worth going back to the start of the weaponization efforts. Back in 2003, Iran had what they call the Ahmad Plan, which was this secret clandestine nuclear programs, nuclear weaponization program, which full details of which have only been uncovered in recent years after the Israelis freed the nuclear archive in this daring expedition. What we've seen now is that in that Ahmad Plan, they were testing gun type projections for the use of a gun type ignition system as opposed to the implosion system. And they were starting to do some work on there. But when the United States invaded Iraq, Iran shuttered the Ahmad Plan and put it into cold storage because of the fears the United States would act against them. Throughout the JCPOA negotiations the first time, and then throughout the early JCPOA-2 negotiations in the last few years, we didn't see quite that much weaponization activity. We would sometimes, however, see clandestine nuclear facilities, which the Iranian regime would not report to the IAEA. There's a few which are still outstanding. There's Turkuzabad is the principal one where they've actually bulldozed the sites, and so the IAEA inspectors found hints of uranium in places that there shouldn't have been. So the key question now for both Israeli and U.S. Security officials is, are there secret nuclear facilities where they're doing that weaponization testing? And if so, how far have they gone? We used to see these statements from the Israelis, from the U.S. officials about, they're 1 to 2 years away. And in the last year and a half or so, we've seen almost nothing of those statements in public. We've seen a lot less statements in public from the United States about the nuclear program at all. And what we are starting to hear from Israeli officials is sort of murmurings that things are not good. The last data point we have is General Milley's testimony to Congress last year, where he said that they were around 7 or several months away on the weaponization front, indicating that there was a decrease from that 2 years that we saw previously, and it was going down. The U.S., however, was given sort of mixed signals in the recent arms control report. The United States said we still do not see the significant weaponization activity, even though all the signs indicate that that might not be the case. In Iran itself, what we're seeing now is backtracking from officials who previously said we will never ever get a nuclear weapon. The Supreme Leader has issued this fatwa against nuclear weapons. And now what we're seeing is senior Iranian nuclear officials and then security officials saying, that fatwa might be negotiable. There's caveats to that. We have to take Israel's security and Iran's security into account. Now, there's this key question for all of us, which is this posturing designed to threaten and try to increase pressure on the West? Or is this a serious way of signaling that there's actually been a change in the regime's own thinking and calculus about how it gets, whether it goes and decides to get a nuclear weapon and under what conditions it does? So I think, what Bibi is in his sort of infamous now speech at the United Nations had was that red line of here's the line at which if Iran gets there is the precipitator of likely military action. The question is, when do we know, and will we ever know when that line has been reached? This is probably the most important question for U.S. and Israeli security and intelligence officials.
Thanks, Gabe. Maybe two brief footnotes. You mentioned gun type and implosion type nuclear weapons. So just because I think it might be important a little later in our discussions, I'd point out that to create that nuclear chain reaction, the fissile material needs to be compressed under high pressure in some way, and the two main existing mechanisms for doing that, or at least for basic bombs, is the implosion type, where you basically pack and surround the fissile material, the enriched uranium, in a ball of explosives, and that explodes first, and the explosive wave, the concussion from that explosion, condenses the fissile material. That's an implosion type. So the Fat Man bomb that the U.S. dropped in World War II was an implosion type. Or alternatively, a gun type is basically where you take two different pieces of fissile material, and through an explosion, you ram them together, basically using one as a bullet, that therefore is a gun type, hitting a target of enriched uranium or plutonium, and that causes the nuclear chain reaction. And Little Boy, the other nuclear weapon that we dropped in World War II, was a gun type weapon. But on this question of red lines, Gabe, that you raised, back in 2012, Prime Minister Netanyahu draw that red line at a bomb's worth of 20% enriched uranium. And I think it's notable that from 2012 until the first preliminary nuclear deal was announced in 2014, Iran never crossed that red line. They kept enriching more and more 20% enriched uranium, but then they dilute it back in order to never cross that red line, which showed how credible that was. So let me ask you, I guess, Jonathan, is there an equally clear red line today on behalf of the United States or Israel?
Yeah, that's a great question, and certainly one where I readily debate myself. I mean, I think the answer ultimately is no. When Netanyahu drew that red line, Iran's program was much smaller, and he was drawing it across the one basic throughput that the choke point Iran would have to go through to get fissile material for a bomb. And we also knew a lot more about Iran's program back then. And part of the reason to make your red lines credible and enforceable is you know what you're actually trying to stop. I think today, given the combination of just how much closer Iran is to a breakout, I mean, Blaze, you probably remember even better than I do what Iran's breakout time was when Netanyahu drew that red line, but it was probably a couple months, not a week. And that was for one bomb, not an arsenal's worth. Iran is able to ramp up much more quickly now. But again, I think the big problem, and Gabe certainly got to this in some of his remarks, is we don't know what we don't know fully about the program today. And so again, you can only draw clear red lines if you have clarity about what you're trying to stop. And I think that's the big problem.
Yeah, Jonathan, I was looking back at some of the work we did back in 2012, 2013, and we had these graphs of Iran's breakout time and what it could come down to, and it started around 120 days, and then we projected it down, and we would draw this red zone at 30 days, because below 30 days was, we thought was unacceptable. If it ever got down to 30 days, someone would have to act, because it was too dangerous to have Iran so close to a breakout. And here we are, potentially 30 hours away. It's really has changed a lot. But Gabe, so we don't have a red line. We're not confident that weaponization isn't in process. It's no longer 2 years away. So what, if anything, is the U.S. and its European partners doing about it?
So this is, I think, one of the key questions of, are we teaching the Iranian regime the right lessons for their strategic policymakers so that they think that there are consequences, there are problems if they go further? What we've seen thus far has been in the first year and a half of the regime's enrichment from start of 2021, through mid-2022. There were absolutely no consequences of any meaningful nature. They had maybe one censure resolution at the IAEA back in 2022, and that was about it. Very few sanctions at all were imposed on Iran. Very few sanctions were enforced across the board. The Europeans had originally said 20% was sort of their, not red line, but their line where they would snap back UN sanctions. That came and went. Then they said it was 60%. That came and went. Iran went up as far as 84% enrichment briefly. That came and went. And so the Europeans certainly haven't held to their consequences. The United States has found that it is difficult to impose further economic consequences without an alliance of countries who are willing and able to do things. And so if you're an Iranian decision maker right now, what you have seen is, compared to where they were in 2012, even where they were in the Trump administration, they've been able to go far, far beyond where they ever have been before, and they haven't gotten a lot of pushback. And so one of the arguments I make about why Iran might go and try to go for a nuclear breakout is their analysis that there just haven't been consequences for past nuclear escalations. And so why would there be future costs for future escalations? I think if you look at Vladimir Putin and you look at his calculus of why he decided to go into Ukraine, a lot of this was this cost benefit analysis of looking at European and American actions in other theaters in areas like the energy sector and saying, there does not seem to be a will to impose costs, and there does not seem to be any will to fight a war kinetically. And in light of that inaction, in light of that immense risk aversion, that presents a good opportunity to go and invade. China, obviously, right now is looking at the same calculus for Taiwan, although it's, I think, a few years away out at minimum there. And so I think this is going to be the key question is, what is their determination of, does a red line actually exist? And is there willingness on the part of the US and Israeli coalition to actually go and take out Iran's nuclear program or try to do so? Or are they so distracted with the security concerns on their own borders that that's just not in the works? And I deeply fear that that is the case that Iranian decision makers are.
Let me play devil's advocate a little bit here, Gabe. And if we look at sort of Iran's most recent nuclear saber rattling, it seems to be in response to potentially offensive moves being made by the U.S. and Israel, right? I think some of those statements that you mentioned of Iranian officials saying that they are going to consider building nukes. My favorite one was, I think, likening it to a car and saying, you know, we have the body, we have the engine, we have the wheels, we just need to put them all together. You know, those happened in the aftermath of the Israeli strike, or we presume Israeli strike, at a air defense system near Natanz, near Iranian nuclear facilities. The most recent announcements of the centrifuges that are now being added, that came this weekend, was in reaction to the U.S. and European partners working together at the last meeting of the IAEA to censure Iran and say not happy about its progress. So it seemed that, you know, it's Iran pushing back against pressure that seems to create these advances. So maybe if we left it well enough alone, it wouldn't need to keep escalating its nuclear program.
You know, if there's one thing I want to compliment the Iranian foreign policy system at, it is at creating lessons and trying to always teach the Western system that there are specific and reciprocal consequences to every act of pressure against the Iranian regime. When Iranian ships started, oil tankers started blowing up, they started mining other ships in response. Whenever their officials get taken prisoner in European countries on human rights violations or terrorism charges, they go and they kidnapped European citizens as ransom. And so they learn to do this to try again to build deterrence. And I think they're always wary about how are we deterring the European and American militaries and national security establishments. I'll also fight against my own position here a little bit and say the way that we've seen the Iranian nuclear advances are completely unlike anything we saw with the Soviet Union, with China, with India, with Pakistan, even with North Korea. None of these countries telegraphed the way that the Iranian regime telegraphs every single thing they do. Not everything, but most of the things they do with their nuclear program. They invite journalists, they have big press releases, they make quotes that are newsworthy, like the one about the car that you mentioned, versus the other nuclear scientists are completely sequestered, and one day a nuclear device explodes in the desert or the tundra of these countries, and that's their announcement. What we've seen in Iran is very much this focus on how do we use the nuclear program as negotiating leverage and as geopolitical points of pressure on our rivals.
Uh, so let me ask you guys. I mean, we've talked about how advanced their program is, and we've talked about how we have had in the past, but no longer have red lines. Sort of these, the idea of which at least is that there is a clearly identifiable moment where we can tell Iran is going for it, right, and we can stop them. Um, you know, is there still going to be such a moment? I mean, I guess first of all, is Iran going for a nuclear weapon? Are we going to be able to tell? Um, is there a place where we can draw a red line? Is it still possible to draw a red line? Is it still possible to prevent them? Jonathan, where do you come out on this?
So I don't think it's possible to draw coherent red lines given again the obscurity that we're operating under in terms of the full extent of Iran's nuclear infrastructure, and then also I think the timeframes in which we would have to be expected to detect any move toward either a nuclear weapons capability where they have enough uranium at proper levels, they have a workable nuclear device, and they already have the delivery vehicle. I think given those time constraints and also the lack of information we're operating under, short of resolving those two things, I don't think we can have credible red lines, on top of the fact and magnified by the fact that Iran has already heard enough empty threats from the United States and our partners on the diplomatic front, the military front. Gabe mentioned the sort of the reciprocal responses and pressure put on us. I would say they've established a pretty good form of escalation dominance over us on the diplomatic and military fronts more generally. And I would just say part of the thing is I'm kind of bullish on the fact that I think the Iranians could make a jump from potentially having a nuclear weapons capability to a bomb just so quickly. I mean, you look at the two nuclear weapons that we detonated over Japan in 1945. Those were shipped out in separate pieces and assembled on Tinian, a couple days before their use. Iran would know how to do something similar. I think, that again, to go back to the point, red lines have to be credible and enforceable. And I think at this point, Iran knows it can move more quickly and swiftly and coherently to put a bomb together if it wants than we could reliably detect, let alone move to neutralize it.
Gabe, where do you come out on this? Are we going to know before Iran goes nuclear? Can
I
we
doubt
know?
it. So when we do typically know when a country tests a nuclear device, we have excellent satellites, we have earthquake detection that can generally, and this has been the case when the Soviet Union, when China, when North Korea tested us, we generally knew within either hours or a couple days whether that happened. Um, I think the problem here is what we've seen is that Iran has been creating multiple new underground facilities, dispersing these in multiple locations. And so it's one thing if you go and you say, okay, we need to do this, Top Gun style elimination of one facility. But if they're splitting these components and the key systems and having duplication across several sites, then the challenge for the US or Israel becomes we need to take out 6 different sites and completely decimate them to be able to have fidelity that we're not creating this. So again, that becomes a lot more difficult. I think we have to also look at what would be the precipitating action or conditions that would lead Iran to do something like this. One is they're going to want the United States and Israel to be distracted. On the Israeli front, obviously, I think we have the conditions there and have for the last 8 months of distraction, of strategic focus from the Israeli government on other problems. From the United States, we're very good at being able to multitask in different theaters. The key challenge will be a China conflict. If there's something kinetic that breaks out over Taiwan, we are going to have to send most of our naval assets into that theater, and we are going to be spending the entirety of our, political bandwidth on solving that problem. That is a key opportune moment for Iran to make such a test and test our systems of saying, do we have the political will right now to move a bunch of our systems into CENTCOM and help Israel conduct these things? And then the question is, what existential threat does Iran feel that they need to change? They're not on the brink of collapse today. If they haven't gotten a nuclear weapon for nearly 20 years of having a nuclear program, why would that condition change, and what would be required? And then what do they get out of it? Is this that there's
We seem to have lost Gabe momentarily here. So while hopefully we get his connection back, Jonathan, if I could turn to you, you had drawn the distinction, which I think Gabe was just sort of starting to talk about, between nuclear capability, which was, as the Iranians recently said, having all the parts of a car but not having assembled it and put it on the road yet, and then actually having a nuclear weapon. Sort of, what's your sense of which strategy or which place the Iranians want to be at? Do they want to be just a nuclear capable state? Do they actually want to be a nuclear state? What are the strategic choices for them there?
Yeah, that's obviously the million-dollar question. I think their preference is to be a nuclear weapons capable state. As you and I have said, a screwdriver's turn away from having the bomb itself. My belief, I sort of work backwards from this, which is, as Gabe and I have spoken about, and I think we're in agreement, Iran's been pretty good at building counter leverage against all the attempts to try to pressure it into sacrificing its program or making real concessions on that front. And so I think at this point, the one thing Iran would like to avoid doing is actually developing a nuclear weapon in a way that's overt, demonstrative, or provable in some sense, even if it doesn't mean igniting a mushroom cloud in the desert or underground that a seismograph can pick up. Because I think from Iran's perspective, that would be the one thing that finally stirs the world to some sort of concerted action. And certainly, the prevention cat would be out of the bag at that point. But a key example is you look at the Soviet Union's surprise test in 1949 served as a real invigorating shock to the U.S. system and really supercharged our efforts through NSC 68 and other efforts to really get serious about waging the Cold War, even though there'd been a buildup before then. And so I think from Iran's perspective, short of some of the threats that Gabe laid out, like regime collapse or something like that, I think that they feel that as long as they're in a position to be able to move and produce a weapon more quickly and credibly than we can threaten to stop it, I think they have no real incentive to go over the finish line and stoke this counter coalition. And one thing that further influences my view there is Iran's been very busy developing its own second strike capabilities. Certainly the target set and the intelligence on that target set in terms of what you'd have to neutralize or hope to neutralize in a military action against Iran's nuclear program, much more manifold and complex than it was when we were talking about Netanyahu's threats in 2012. And that's deterrence by denial. Iran has also boosted its own deterrence by punishment, because it at least believes, and I think it has some real measure of an ability to threaten such retaliation for the region, U.S. bases, our Arab allies, Israel as well, in addition to what's already going on the several fronts we're seeing since 10/7. I think that makes Iran feel more confident that they're in a good position where they are now, where they can suggest they're very close. They can even let hints leak out that they have the capability to do it on short notice without having to put their money where their mouth is and risk something that finally produces a coherent containment regime or something else like that on on a proven nuclear power.
Gabe, good to have you back with us. Let me just ask you something, but before I do, let me let the audience know that we'll be opening it up to audience Q&A here momentarily. So if you do have a question for Jonathan or Gabe, feel free to submit it using the Q&A feature in Zoom. If you write your question out there, I'll be sure to pose it to them and get their response. But Gabe, Jonathan was just laying out his views of why Iran might prefer to stay in the nuclear capable camp, sort of having all the pieces of the car but not yet assembling it. Is that your view of sort of the strategic choice that they'll make and where they prefer to be, or do you think that maybe they want to go all the way to being sort of a visibly and recognized nuclear weapon armed state?
Well, if you look from, certainly 2009, 2015, that was where they chose to be, and that's where they've chosen to be for the past 5 years. So it's clearly something that they are comfortable in, even though the act of doing so has brought enormous economic consequences against them. They've had, more than a decade combined now of severe and various times economic sanctions against them. It's crippled their ability to modernize their economy. So this has come with real significant costs, and yet their system has decided that those are costs worth having to have this pressure. Now, I think if you ask the Iranian system right now and said, okay, you can have 10 years of still not having a nuclear weapon, but facing all these economic consequences, you get a lot of Iranian leaders say that doesn't really seem worth it. But they have now gotten to this point where they can't just give up their nuclear leverage without any concession. There's also a strong sense of nationalism inside the regime that says we deserve to have a nuclear weapon, and or at least the recognition of the power that comes and prestige that comes with such an advanced program. You look at Russia, China, India, Pakistan, some of whom Pakistan certainly they view as a peer, and they say we should have that same level of national power. And even the fact that you have hordes of countries coming and talking about them and trying to beg them to act one way or another is a form of leverage. They can use this to extract concessions on sanctions that reduce their pressure on their terror program, on their military. And so it's a bit of an insurance policy on their nation from all sorts of other threats. And I think that's why they're pretty happy where they are.
All right, let's turn to some audience questions. Stuart Lockman asks, the discussion in the media today is that if Israel attacks Hezbollah, that Iran will join in. How does that discussion tie into this one? I.e., if there is much broader war in the region, will that spur Iran to take the final steps? Jonathan, I know this is something that you've been thinking about and working on lately, so let me start with you.
Yeah, that's a great question. And obviously, Hezbollah is designed and been built into the force they are today as an insurance policy in case Israel ever goes after the Iranian nuclear program. And so ipso facto, one thing Hezbollah is not intended to do is to get into its own shooting match with Israel, irrespective of the Iranian nuclear dimension. It's my belief that certainly we've seen a signal of intent, if not capability, from the Iranians since April 13th toward targeting Israel directly. And certainly if Israel goes to war with Hezbollah under whatever circumstances, it's going to extend beyond Lebanon. Iran or its proxies have already fired the first shot on all 7 fronts that are now embroiling the region. And certainly I think we'd see that ramped up if Israel gets into war with Hezbollah, which would necessarily, I think, be very likely to drag the Iranians in. I don't feel the same way I used to years ago, though, about Iran's fear of losing Hezbollah as its insurance policy. I think it would be a massive blow. I think they'd get involved in any Israel-Hezbollah major conflict. But I don't think necessarily that if Israel accomplishes its objectives and reduces Hezbollah to something that can no longer pose the threat like it does today, I still don't necessarily think that would be the precipitating effect for the Iranians to say, oh my gosh, we've lost our insurance policy. Now we have to race to the bomb and beat everyone else to it before they get to our program.
Gabe,
There was
any
a
thoughts on that?
excellent there was an excellent op-ed in the Hill by our moderator and GINSA's president Mike Markovsky today, which was laying out the argument that look, a war between Israel and Hezbollah is getting more likely. One of the arguments was because of the nuclear escalation, but also on its own merits. And I think if you're Israeli security officials now and you say we let Hamas develop their capabilities without consequence, that was a mistake. Will we allow Hezbollah to further increase their arsenal without consequence and without limit? That too might be a mistake. And so I think both the nuclear question and the Hezbollah question are nearing ahead. I completely agree with Jonathan. I think an attack on Iran's nuclear program does precipitate an attack from Hezbollah on Israel, but not necessarily the reverse. That again, Iran's questions of whether it goes nuclear have major international consequences. It risks the United States coming in and doing something that could be separate from a Hezbollah-U.S. war, Hezbollah-Israel war. And the other thing that Israel has to keep in mind, again, is will it allow Hezbollah to increase its capabilities indefinitely and without limit, or does it have a red line there? How do they manage those two threats? Can they bring the United States in as a coalition partner in such a war? And obviously that is sort of one area where you look at the U.S.-Israel-Saudi deal. One of the things that has widely been reported is that it includes a U.S.-Israel military pact of some sort, which would most likely include U.S. obligations to come in and help if there were a war between Hezbollah. That is the kind of thing that makes Iran really, really nervous, because then its entire strategy for defending its nuclear program comes into doubt if you say, okay, well, Hezbollah's leaders do not want to start a major war with the United States. That is spelling its own destruction there.
I would just jump in and add a yes and to Gabe's comment there. Certainly, I think the United States is the only actor that really has the military capacity to remotely credibly threaten Iran's military program at this point. I think Israel alone would struggle to make that type of threat. But I think the United States lacks all credibility for Iran or even Hezbollah to really worry that if there was a major shooting match, that they'd be picking a fight with more than just Israel, that they'd be bringing in America too.
Well, that segues perfectly to our next question from Len Hodorkovsky. So, Jonathan, maybe just keep going. But what is the U.S. prepared to do if we determine the regime is about to attain a nuke? Should we act militarily or stand back and let Israel deal with it?
I think we should consider seriously how to prepare for such an attack, because we have not done anything remotely like that, certainly under the current administration. And I'll make this a bipartisan criticism. I think our promises to stop a nuclear Iran have always outstripped our willingness and capability, increasingly, especially both of those since it first happened, depending on how you measure it, either under Bill Clinton or George W. Bush. And I think that we keep saying, even now, the Biden administration still says we're not going to allow Iran to develop nuclear weapons. And if I'm the Iranians, there's a yawning gap between that pledge and any perceived willingness of the United States to fulfill it. Gabe mentioned earlier, we've got competing draws in our attention all around the world, even if we're capable of focusing on multiple things and walking and chewing gum at the same time compared to some of our allies. If I'm the Iranians, I think the U.S. has telegraphed our desire, and in many ways, explicitly, implicitly, through our actions and our words, that we don't want to assume any more risk in the Middle East, and we'll hide behind the fig leaf of trying to manage escalation, even though the end result seems to be more and more of it, where we find ourselves on the unhappy end of it. So the U.S. has the capacity for a credible military threat, but the first step is to really start thinking seriously about what all would be entailed to make that threat credible, to make that capacity credible through our intent, and a bunch of more concrete preparations that would have to happen. We're light years away from that.
I think Len's question is really excellent. I'm always surprised that we don't get this question in the public discourse more. If you ask the question, should the United States intervene to protect Taiwan? That was one of the most asked questions in the whole East Asia theater. Should the United States protect Ukraine from a Russian invasion? Was a highly asked question 2.5 years ago. Very few people ask a very deep and existential question. My personal answer to this is, I was always of the view, 5 years ago, that it would be in Israel's interest first to intervene and do something before it became in our clear national interest for the United States. Today, I'm not quite so sure that's the case anymore. I think what we've seen is contagion is real. What we've seen is the Iranian threats against Israel very quickly have spill over, and an Iranian nuke would very quickly be deployed to threaten U.S. interests, security interests, personnel, our allies in Saudi or partners in Saudi Arabia, UAE. And so I think now to say that this is just an Israeli problem, or it is primarily an Israeli problem, I don't think it really works out. I don't think we have that the luxury to say these are separate problems. And so I think it certainly will be the United States problem. The question, and this is a hard question, a real question, is will we, at the point when Iran may or may not decide to go to get that nuclear weaponization, will we have the bandwidth realistically if we are involved in the Ukraine-Russia front, a Taiwan perhaps a hot war with China? Do we really have the ability to get involved in a third theater in a major military operation? That is a hard question. I think Israeli leaders need to be prepared to do it alone, even if we don't want them to have to go alone.
Gabe, that was a really fascinating observation about, we're willing to talk about protecting Taiwan, assisting Ukraine, but not preventing a nuclear Iran. Why do you think that is? Is it because, President Obama in that 2015 speech about the JCPOA so clearly delineated anyone who's against the deal as a warmonger, and no one wants to be a warmonger, that we can't even imagine that possibility? Is it because, in the case of Taiwan and Ukraine, there's the predicate is a very clear act of overt aggression, whereas sprinting for a bomb is not necessarily that, and therefore this would be a preemptive or preventive war, and that's much harder to stomach for people. Is it because there in Ukraine and Taiwan we're talking about coming to assistance of a partner, whereas this is us doing it ourselves? Why is it so hard for us to have that discussion?
I think if there's a growing third rail in the question of American foreign policy, it would be the idea that we're doing another land war in the Middle East. And so I think most Americans rightly say we have zero interest in new wars in the Middle East. And the implication being that if there's an attack on Iran's nuclear program, that's sort of what is entailed. I don't think that's necessarily the case. I don't think Iran has any interest in getting to a full-out war with the United States, because it knows that would not end well for itself. But I think the question for Taiwan, you ask a lot of leaders why we should go and defend Taiwan, and they'll make economic arguments. They'll say, the world's semiconductor supply, the world's trade all flows through through this area. And if you're looking at the Middle East, oil is becoming a lot less of an element of American national security. Still there, but we have a lot of domestic supply. It's hard to make that economic argument, and a lot of them kind of rest on political arguments about how do we defend our allies and partners in the region, and it becomes a question of loyalty rather than self-interest. That's always a dangerous game to play with the American public. Requesting them to rely on sort of values propositions rather than interest-based arguments of this is in our interest to do so. And I think as policymakers or opinion makers ourselves, we should think, can we make the case to the American public that we should have American soldiers get involved and perhaps die for this operation?
All right, Gabe, let me also maybe start with you for the next couple of questions from Mark Leitner, who asks, do you think if President Trump gets elected in November, that will make Iran run to get a nuclear weapon before he gets inaugurated? Or more generally, what effect does the upcoming election have on the U.S. ability to stop Iran's nuclear program?
Great question. I think the Iranian leadership is concerned about the prospect of President Trump coming back in, mostly because they are a lot less sure what he will do on a number of fronts. If you look at both, yes, there's the Soleimani case of Trump can act in a way that is violently against their interests. But then there's also the case where Iran shot down a US drone, and the United States did not do anything publicly. And so, again, if the dream for the Iranian regime is they have a table where they can say, if we do X, the United States will do Y. And Trump's lack of predictability is not something that they enjoy, because it makes them hard to understand what the outcomes are to their events. There's also, of course, President Trump has talked a lot about maximum pressure on Iran and that we would bankrupt the regime very quickly. And so they certainly do not look forward to that prospect. I don't think that they would choose to go nuclear as a result, or as I'm not sure that would affect their calculus there. What I would say is I think they would trust that the United States threats are a little bit more credible than the Biden administration's threats have been in this regard. There's been a lack of consistency in the current administration and how it messages militarily. At one point, the State Department's Iran envoy said that there is no military solution to preventing Iranian nuclear weaponization, which is not the case. And so I think on these fronts, you're going to see a lot more hesitation from Iran responding to President Trump versus a second term of President Biden.
Thanks, Gabe. Jonathan, let me turn to you maybe with our last question again from Len Hodorkovsky. Is deployment of a dirty bomb, and I would add maybe an EMP, possible or likely?
I think certainly possible, especially because in a lot of ways it probably wouldn't require Iran to do a lot of things we talked about at the outset, like producing 90% enriched uranium, or having a fully developed sophisticated warhead that would fit on a traditional delivery vehicle like a missile. Something like a dirty bomb or EMP. It's certainly I think a weapon of the week. We talk about those would be things that terrorists would use on the dirty bomb case, or in the case of an EMP, something to create outsized effects. Potentially like something Russia might use by detonating it in the ionosphere or high above, where it creates these cascading effects, but doesn't necessarily produce a mushroom cloud over a major city. Certainly possible. I would certainly hesitate to say likely, or even more likely than a more traditional path into the nuclear weapons threshold, just given how advanced Iran is, and again how it remains a screwdriver's turn away in a lot of respects from having the traditional breakout capability and developing a traditional nuclear weapon if it ultimately chose to.
Yeah, on that point, I was struck recently, there's been some reporting about preparations that the US and NATO countries have been making in the eventuality of Russia using nuclear weapons in Ukraine, both to help mitigate the damage, but then also to sort of do the forensic investigation to get a hold of the weapon, to get the material, the nuclear material, to do the sort of proof needed to say that it was a Russian weapon. Reporting that I imagine is being put out there to try to dissuade the Russians, A, from doing it, or B, from them thinking that they could have some sort of plausible deniability in case there was some sort of nuclear explosion. We don't see any of those sorts of preparations happening in the Middle East, right? And like at a very bare minimum, the costs of having those sorts of preparations, of signaling that sort of determination to hold Iran to account even after the fact, is completely missing from the region. But let me ask you guys, any final thoughts on where Iran is with its nuclear program, where it's going, and what we can do to stop it in 2 minutes or less? Gabe.
I think the final comment I was going to make before my internet got cut off was, I think the Supreme Leader's hopefully going to die in the next couple of years. That he is the guy that calls the shots. If the commander in chief here is the one that determines whether the United States goes to war, it is the Supreme Leader that determines whether they will get a bomb. When we have a transition, I hope into a free and democratic Iran, but probably more likely into the next Supreme Leader, that is going to be a key question of, does that person simply have a completely different philosophy than Khamenei? And that could be an interesting factor of whether or not Iran eventually decides to get a bomb.
Jonathan?
Yeah, I would just say, I think, Gabe and I are sort of debating the flip sides of a coin here. But to mix metaphors, the ultimate answer, I think, is it ultimately comes down to a coin toss. And I think 51 times out of 100, I say Iran doesn't need to break out. And 49 times I say I could totally see why they would. And I think one thing just to emphasize for everyone here is, again, it's a theme I've been hitting upon, which is the sort of the unpredictability and the obscurity of a lot of Iran's progress, and also the decision making that would remain between here and actually having a bomb. The United States has, pretty impressively missed a lot of the nuclear weapons tests throughout history. The Soviet, the Chinese, even the French, our NATO allies, surprised us with their nuclear tests. I think a lot of the decision making, especially as these programs become much more sophisticated over time, and they're not crash programs to build a bomb and to fill up the fishbowl and wine glass as fast as possible. A lot of that decision making is more mercurial. It's not just a top-down decision, even though that would have a huge effect. It could come from the bottom up, from the scientists who've been working on the program all these years. That was the case with the Indian test, and even as Gabe mentioned, Iran briefly went to 84% a year and a half ago. From all I've heard and from all I can understand, that was a test that came from the bottom up, a decision that was not from the top down. So I think that's something certainly to watch as well, and to keep in mind in devising policy and looking for ways forward. Keep in mind, the things we still don't know, because they're a big part of the decision making going forward.
Well, Jonathan, Gabe, thanks so much for lending your expertise to us this afternoon. For those of you who tuned in, thank you for watching. Let me just quickly commend to you several products that JINSA has put out related to this, or that we mentioned. The first is an excellent NatSec brief by Jonathan from about 10 days ago, detailing the status of Iran's nuclear program with a lot of those charts that he showed at the beginning. Secondly, last year we put out a report called No Daylight, talking about what would happen if Israel attacked Iran's nuclear program, and the importance of the U.S. standing firmly behind and beside Israel in that case to prevent an Iranian retaliation and a broader war. And finally, Gabe, thanks for mentioning. Mike Mikovsky and I have a piece in The Hill about the Hezbollah-Israel war is not a question of if, but of when. You can find all of those at our website at jinsa.org. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll see you on the next webinar. Thank you.
Thank you.